Whenever I start painting, the first thing I do is to nail down the base color, the foundation for all the other colors that you see. For the blonde hair, the base color is usually either a cool greenish brown or a warm orangey brown, depending on the model's hair type. Next, I focus on the inner quality, especially on the materiality, the inner nature of what I'm painting. With hair, we can certainly say that hair is thin, it's volatile, it's transparent, and it's dynamic, as opposed to skin, which is firm, solid, and definitely more opaque. So when it comes to the choice of base color, I try to avoid heavy opaque pigments and go for transparent tones instead. So for this model here, for this type of hair here, my base color is raw amber with a touch of transparent oxide red for those warm shadows. And because hair is so fluid and dynamic, I really try to avoid hard defined edges. I like to use brushes that help me get to that softness and the rhythm. My go-to brushes for hair are long flat hog brushes like these ones here. Most of the times I stick to just one brush for the whole process. So moving on, I'm using raw amber with just a touch of transparent oxide red to block in the silhouette of this hair. I'm filling the paint mix with a solvent, a lean medium, to help it flow better. I'm using Miracle Medium from Michael Hardin, however you can also use Gamsol. The silhouette is very important. Usually we understand a lot about what hair we are painting by the silhouette. And here, for instance, we can certainly understand that we are not painting curly hair, we are not painting afro hair, we are certainly painting straight to wavy hair. Next, I want to identify the main areas of shadow and light, along with some key tonalities. In this case, I can spot about 3 to 4 main tonal ranges. The darkest shadow here, up here, and then another block over here, which is a mid-tone that transitions into the light. And then down here, there is a big area, which is sort of a triangle shape, and that's the most exposed to the light. We could definitely break this light area into 2 parts. I like to keep my palette pretty limited for this piece here to lighten that deep shadow and the midtones transitioning into the light. I start mixing some yellow ochre with my base color, which is the raw amber. And then, of course, as I move into the light, I add more yellow ochre and I reduce the amount of raw amber and I start mixing in some white, titanium white. For the highlights, of course, there is more and more titanium white and even pure titanium white. However, we leave the highlights as the last part. Okay, so let's start by blocking in the shadow here. At first, of course, we can keep it pretty blocky. Don't get caught up in details just yet. Just mark this shadow area and the transition in a blocky way so we can really give the hair a solid base. I'm adding also a little bit of that oxide red because there is some warm reflected light hitting the shadow. Now I'm just checking where the other shadow areas are and I'm blocking those in too. Remember that you can also apply less pressure on the brush or use less paint to create a sort of mid-tones or a smoother transition from the shadow to the light. And now, while I'm here, let me mention that the edges where the hair casts a shadow on the skin, like on the forehead or on the side of the face, tend to be warm. So I'm putting down a thin line of oxide red to hint at that shadow right now. We can't really leave heavy marks here because hair is thin, it's delicate and it's volatile. So let's really avoid any hard lines. And I'm just adding a bit more definition to this very basic portrait while I have the same tone for the eyebrows. Now we can start transitioning into the light and adding those mid-tones. You can see the transparent raw amber we blocked in earlier is working really well as a mid-tone. Nonetheless, I want to add a bit more solidity, especially here, by mixing a mid-tone with a yellow ochre and raw umber. This combination also works pretty well if you wanna paint gold. In fact, I use the same three colors. However, for gold, I would add more yellow ochre and a little bit more white to make it appear more solid. I think this mid-tone here feels just right. And I'm also going to add a bit more oxide red where the shadows look really warm. And I'm also smoothing out this harsh transition between the deep shadow and the mid-tone. Let's move onto the lightest area. And of course now we are mixing more yellow ochre and starting to add some more titanium white. Remember to use your brushes to follow the anatomy and the rhythm of the hair. Lightly hover and lift your brushes to create smooth transitions without needing to blend too much. Before we dive into the highlights, let's look at how to use the edges to add more definition to the hair. Usually, the edges against the background tell us a lot about the hair type. For instance, afro hair has a very soft edges, while curly hair has more angular edges, and straight hair has very cleaner lines. Now keep this in mind, if you work the edges well with the background, it will help your portrait feel more integrated with the rest of the painting, instead of looking just like it's stuck on. Now I need a bit of neutral color here for the background to show you how I usually work with the edges. I'm using ivory black mixed with titanium white to create a bluish grey. Ivory black has a bluish tint when you mix it with white. So really when you introduce the background color, try to apply very light pressure. Let some of the hair color mix with the background naturally. Of course, don't force it, be very subtle. Remember to hold your brushes from the tip and be kind of playful in the way you work here at the edges. And if you can create some rhythm, try not to be stiff. So I'm following the silhouette, but at the same time, I'm kind of deliberately going inside. Just a tiny bit, just very subtle. And then you will see that I will take the brush, clean the brush, because I'm just doing everything with the same brush, and pull some of the hair into the background. So make this mark. I think this was going a bit more down on that side. So, okay, perfect. Of course, when you move then onto the face, you can really see the difference between that edge and the one for the hair. The face edge is way sharper and more defined. In reality, when you paint, you can describe your subject, the hair or the eyes or the entire portrait as much from the inside as you can from the outside. For instance, you can describe it via the edges, the negative space, and what's around your subject. So really take some time with the edges, because defining your subject in these less obvious ways adds a lot of sophistication to your final painting. As you can see, there is always like a little bit of push and pull between the edges. And when you are filling in monochromatic areas like this background, make sure to move your brushes in different directions. This will add a nice rhythm to the overall composition. Again, be gentle and be subtle and glide your brush over the surface without applying too much pressure. No hard edges in the hair. Remember, just glide and lift your brushes like sort of touch, no touch. So now let's move on to the highlights, and of course we add more white into our mixture, and I also want to use the same brush, this hog brush, and I want to fully load it, and I want to see what happens when I glide it over my tones. Perfect. I think it works really well and really easy. The edges down here are very soft, so we can use again the tip of our brush to create that softness. In general, keep in mind to create a sort of contrast around the hair, your subject. So alternate hard edges with soft edges, change texture, create contrast with color, with chroma, with the way the brushwork, the way you apply paint, because all this is what really makes a portrait really interesting. And I'm just adding some more highlights, still with the same brush, more and more. Try to locate them in the specific place where they happen naturally. And finally, let me show you how to use a fan brush for creating highlights and those final smooth transitions in the hair. The fan brush particularly makes the hair look super natural and flowing. You can really use this brush to add those delicate highlights without being too harsh. Just flick the brush across the surface to mimic the way the light catches the hair, and it really helps create that soft, breezy effect. Here, even if it's not very clear from the photograph, usually anything that it's at the edge that it's turning away, like in her case, even if in the photographs here it's super overexposed and it's kind of, there is massive highlights there, I want to make sure that I do create a little bit of, I want to put a little bit of a darker tone, because that will still make sure that I create this impression of volume of actually an object, a 3D object, which is turning away. So there we go. I want to go over the edges here and put a bit more yellow ochre in this case. And finally, when it comes to add highlights in the shadow or in the midtones, I'm pretty careful. If you decide to include them, just make sure that they are darker than the highlights that they are in the lightest part of the hair. Those highlights in the shadow still need to be darker because they are not fully in the light yet. So keep that in mind to maintain that natural look. So I just use yellow ochre to create that tiny highlight that we see here in this photograph. There you go. This way looks much more natural. And let's just finish this off with the very last highlights. So I'm wrapping up this short demo on how to paint hair. And I hope this approach has been helpful and made the subject matter feel a bit more approachable for you. Remember to revisit the same principles: base color, the inner materiality of the subject, shadow shapes, edges, and so on. This principle, in fact, apply to pretty much anything that you paint. If you are interested in seeing me in action with curly, afro, or red hair, please consider enrolling in the 6-month program, where I will include a comprehensive chapter on hair along with some great demos. And now I will take you around my website to explain in more detail how the mentorship works.